A Soviet Union submarine, B-59, was hiding underwater in the Caribbean Sea, just a few kilometers away from the US, ready to attack. Suddenly, the US Navy detected it and dropped small bombs into the water to force the submarine to surface. The submarine had lost contact with its headquarters thousands of kilometers away, and the captain feared that war had already started. He thought it was time to fire the nuclear torpedo missile. This was during a period when tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were at their peak, with both countries' nuclear missiles just a button press away. The Soviet captain was about to press the button to launch the missile when something unexpected happened that saved the world from destruction. This event took place during the 12 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a time when the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union was spiraling out of control. After World War II, the world had already witnessed the devastating effects of nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and America's enormous power was clear. The only country that could challenge the US was the Soviet Union, which had quickly developed its own nuclear technology after World War II. Through several nuclear tests, the Soviet Union indirectly warned the US that it wouldn't just sit back quietly like Japan if attacked. At that time, the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union had both countries keeping their nuclear weapons ready to launch at any moment, whether by land, air, or sea. It was widely known that if either side initiated a nuclear attack, the other would respond with equal force, leading to a destruction far worse than the atomic bombings in Japan. It was estimated that about 70% of the world's population could be wiped out. To make their nuclear attacks more effective, both American and Soviet bomber aircraft stayed airborne constantly, and their nuclear submarines lurked in international waters, just waiting for a signal to strike. In addition, the US had placed its nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy, both NATO allies located close to the Soviet Union's borders. This gave America a stronger position, as it made it easier to attack the western part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union found out about this, they decided to place their nuclear weapons closer to America. The best spot for this was Cuba, just 200 kilometers southeast of the US. At the time, Cuba had a pro-communist government, which the US couldn't tolerate. The US saw Cuba as an ally of the Soviet Union, which was the stronghold of communism. Communism meant that all businesses were controlled by the government, and wealth was distributed equally, preventing the rise of social classes. The US wanted a capitalist system where there was free trade and people could run businesses for profit. The US had already planned to attack Cuba to install a capitalist system. But Cuba's president, Fidel Castro, had the support of the Soviet Union, which also supplied weapons to Cuba. In secret, Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev cut a deal with Fidel Castro to place Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, in Cuba. In exchange, the Soviet Union would protect Cuba from any US attack. This would also allow Soviet nuclear warheads to easily target the South American region. No one knew about this secret deal, and the Soviet Union quietly started installing its ICBMs in various locations in Cuba. However, rumors about this began to spread across the US, causing widespread fear. To verify the truth, the US Air Force used a U-2 spy plane to capture images of Cuba, revealing the presence of medium-range R-12 and intermediate-range R-14 ballistic missile facilities. These photographs were enough to prove that the Soviet Union had tightened its grip on the southeastern part of the US. This news hit US President John F. Kennedy hard, and he decided to teach Cuba a lesson by launching an airstrike. The plan was to destroy the Soviet ICBMs first, and then fully occupy Cuba. However, this plan was almost an invitation to World War III, because attacking Soviet missiles in Cuba would be seen as an attack on the Soviet Union itself. If that happened, both sides would launch their nuclear weapons, triggering a war no one could control. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union prepared for a possible attack, and one of the steps taken was sending the B-59 nuclear submarine to hide deep in the Caribbean Sea near Cuba. The submarine's crew had full authority to launch a nuclear torpedo missile without needing permission from Moscow in case of war. The submarine was so deep that it had lost radio contact with Moscow. When the US Navy suspected a Soviet submarine was in the area, they dropped small bombs to signal the submarine to surface and identify itself. These bombs were depth charges, an anti-submarine weapon that could destroy a submarine if it exploded nearby. Inside the B-59, the captain, already out of contact with Moscow, believed that war had begun and it was time to fire the nuclear torpedo missile. Although the crew had the authority to launch, it required the agreement of all 3 officers on board. 2 of the officers agreed to fire the missile, but one officer, Vasili Arkhipov, was against it. Arkhipov argued that launching a nuclear missile was too risky since they had no confirmation that a war had actually started. After several minutes of intense discussion, the decision was made to surface the submarine and try to re-establish contact with Moscow to assess the situation. At the same time, US and Soviet leaders were meeting to defuse the escalating tensions. They agreed that the Soviet Union would withdraw its nuclear missiles from Cuba, but only on the condition that the US would not invade Cuba afterward. Secretly, the US also agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. This 12-day standoff, known today as the Cuban Missile Crisis, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Both countries had even prepared their nuclear missiles to be launched into space, where they would either be destroyed if the crisis ended or fall onto their targets if war broke out. Fortunately, the crisis was resolved and the missiles were destroyed in space. When the B-59 submarines surfaced and re-established contact with Moscow, they were ordered to return to the Soviet Union. Historians believe that Vasili Arkhipov's decision not to launch the nuclear missile was a crucial moment that saved the world from a catastrophic nuclear war. Many believe that if Arkhipov hadn't made that decision, there might not be any humans left on Earth today. Like this video if you are enjoying it, and also subscribe to my channel to stay informed.